Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Pierluigi Parco. I'm the director of the Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom at the European University Institute. And we thought that it was important today to have this webinar to discuss what is happening about media freedom and the war in Ukraine, connecting the issue of the war with the situation of media freedom. Clearly, the war is an exceptional circumstance that changes the way in which we normally debate this issue and bring us back to somehow the fundamentals of our common way to think to issues like media freedom. And especially in this case, we had this developments in which, as in any war, propaganda and information have become elements of part of the war, but also, as in any war, we have journalists that are dying on the field, and that's another element of our discussion today, the safety of journalists and the situation. And also, as in any war, we have exceptional decisions, and exceptional decisions also in terms of freedom of expression, media freedom. And one decision that we want to discuss today is also the European decision of banning several Russian media, Russia Today and Sputnik in particular, and somehow discuss the legal significance of this banning, but also the more general significance in our vision of freedom of expression in Europe, having also the courage to compare this with the kind of censorship that we are seeing on the other side in Russia from Western, for all kind of Western media and any kind of independent media, and somehow bring this discussion really to the fundamental. The war justifies everything. There is, in exceptional circumstances, decisions need to be taken. What are the limits of the decision? What is the time frame of this decision? How can we later on mend the damages that a war like this does, not only to lives and to everything, but also to our way to stay together and to discuss together, and the freedom of expression, the freedom of our media, the freedom of our democracies. These are the issues. I don't have any answer. I think that is a day for a very open discussion, thinking to today and thinking to the future. And the idea is to start with a legal framing of this discussion, and I will ask to do this to Elda Brogi, that is the scientific professor at the European University Institute, the scientific coordinator of the Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom. Elda is also has a long experience and member of expert committees of the Council of Europe, in which the discussion about media freedom and the treatment of medias in Europe has been always at the center of the discussion of the Council of Europe. Elda, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for those who are participating in this webinar, the speakers and the participants. I see some people that we know since many years, and yes, this webinar comes from our need to better understand and to have a frank and clear discussion with all the relevant stakeholders that are dealing with these times, and they're dealing with media freedom in this very dramatic period. So my aim is just to highlight some of the issues that I see relevant in the discussion, or in framing, let's say, the topic that we are discussing, and in particular the ban of RT and Sputnik. So let's start from the Council decision and regulation. So as you all know, the sanction was published on the official journal on March the 2nd in the form of a Council decision integrated in a Council regulation. And the legal basis of the regulation is Article 215 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union under EU's external action and the common foreign and security policy. So when a decision adopted under this foreign and security policy provides for the interruption or reduction in part or completely of economic and financial relations with one or more third countries, the Council may adopt restrictive measures under the procedures referred in the article against natural or legal persons and groups of non-state entities. So in this case, the ban targets RT and Sputnik, and it means it affects RT and Sputnik because it means a discontinuation of transmission and distribution through satellite and cable, as well as the blocking of the content of these broadcasters on IPTV, internet service providers, internet video sharing platforms or applications, and the broadcasting license or authorization of RT and Sputnik are suspended, and circumvention of these measures is prohibited. The ban has found immediate implementation across the EU by media authorities, institutions, and operators by any means involved in its implementation. And according to what we read on the web, members of the European Regulators Groups for Audiovisual Media Services, so the Elda, expressed more support towards a coordinated EU action, given the emergency of the situation. And online platforms such as Facebook, TikTok have pledged to block the pages of the two media outlets. So the ban of Russia Today and Sputnik is part of the sanctions imposed on Russia for attacking Ukraine and breaking international law. But compared to clear-cut measures such as freezing assets or banning the use of EU airspace, the suspension of the two Russian state-owned outlets is complicated by the fact that we are dealing with media. So this entails connections with freedom of the media and media pluralism, principles that are at the core of European democracy. What comes from the regulation is that in this case, the EU interpreted Russia Today and Sputnik as a weapon for hybrid threats. They are not considered as media somehow, but they are considered weapons. What are Russia Today and Sputnik? They are global media networks that claim to provide, let's say, inverted commas, alternative views in a number of languages, both as subsidiaries of the Russian state-owned Rossiya Segovia news agency and partly funded by the Russian state. Their editorial independence is questionable, considering their strict connection with the Russian government, and studies report how the outlets publish not just factual news, but also numerous fabricated or misleading stories, including conspiracy theories. The so-called nutrition labels used by NewsGuard to categorize news outlets based on their trustworthiness highlight that both outlets severely violate journalistic standards. they repeatedly publish false content, rarely clarify errors, and fail to effectively differentiate between news and, let's say, opinions. The behavior of Russia Today and Sputnik has been under the spotlight of the EU for many years, while the Council decision and regulation are not referring to punctual content, specific shows that should justify the suspension of the license for a specific content they bring. The preamble of the regulation refers to reiterated consistent behaviors of these two broadcasters that in the end have consistently worked as a weapon of continuous and concerted actions of propaganda, targeting civil society in the EU and neighboring countries, and being essential and instrumental in bringing forward and supporting the aggression against Ukraine and for the destabilization of its neighboring countries. So the ban is therefore connected with the nature of these media outlets, and the proof of this nature is the reiterated behavior of the broadcasters. But somehow the regulation is sanctioning Russia Today and Sputnik with no specific analysis of their nature of media and their freedom, let's say, related to it. Freedom of the media and media pluralism, as we all know, are enshrined in Article 11 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. They are basic principles in EU member states' constitutional traditions, part of the standards for assessing the compliance with the rule of law in any given member state. Moreover, in addition to EU and EU member state principle, Article 10 of the European Court of Human Rights, as interpreted by the European Court of Human Rights, protects freedom of expression, including not only the information or ideas that are favorably received or regarded as inoffensive or as a matter of indifference, but also those that offend, shock, or disturb. As we all know, Handyside versus United Kingdom says that such are the demands of that pluralism, tolerance, and broad-mindedness without which there is no democratic society. So it's not illegal to share opposing views or most fabricated news and misleading opinions about matters of public interest, even about a war that takes place outside of the borders of the countries in question. As such, one could argue that banning the outlets inside the EU is an infringement of freedom of expression. Nonetheless, when it comes to the European Convention of Human Rights Standards, in the interpretation of the Court of Strasbourg, media freedom is not an absolute right, but it's limited according to the law and based on specific grounds defined in Article 10.2 of the Convention that include interest of national security, territorial integrity of public safety, prevention of disorder of crime. And Article 17 of the Convention prohibits the abuse of rights, among others, with the aim of keeping non-democratic actors from misusing the rights and freedoms set forth in the Convention. So probably in this case, we could claim that Article 17, Article 10.2 can be used. And Article 17 that prohibits the abuse of right. I would like to stress as a third point that highlighting what, in my opinion, is relevant in framing this issue, that banning Russian media was already taking place in the EU member states. Is not new and something that probably could have expected. So the Audiovisual Media Services Directive was already effectively used in the past years to limit Russian broadcasting, as it allows for the suspension of transmitting programs that incite hatred. For instance, the case of Latvia and Russia RTR. It must be noted that the Council decision and regulation that we are commenting is not the only measure taken in this circumstance, and seems to have a limited scope compared to the current action undertaken at member state level. This time the regulator in the Baltic countries and Poland had acted even a few days before the Council regulation and independently from it by suspending the retransmission of a number of other Russian origin television programs on the ground of threats to national security, or in application of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, stating that a member state can limit freedom of reception and retransmission when an audiovisual media service provided under the jurisdiction of another state prejudice or present a serious and grave risk of prejudice to public security, including the safeguarding of national security and defense. We must stress that the move of the EU is somehow a defensive move. The EU has developed a policy against disinformation at time of crisis. So it's not unexpected. Everything that is happening now is somehow not out of the blue, because the European Union has been developing since many years a policy against disinformation. And claiming that, considering Russia Today and Sputnik as disinformation, it means that they fall into this, this policy. The Council underlined the need to further strengthen the Union's and Member State resilience, as well as their ability to counter hybrid threats, including disinformation, ensuring the coordinated and integrated use of existing and possible new tools for countering hybrid threats at Union and Member State level, and possible responses in the field of hybrid threats, including foreign interference and influence operations, which may cover preventive measures, as well as the imposition of costs on hostile state and non-state actors. Amongst other, the Common Foreign Security Policy as an action plan on disinformation, which sets out actions for a coordinated European response to disinformation and that already tackles Russian propaganda. So the ban probably can be justified, but on several grounds, let's say, but still might be not effective. The current situation in Europe seems to provide sufficient justification for restrictions on media that abuse the rights to freedom of expression, given that there is a war in the immediate neighborhood of the EU. Hundreds of thousands of refugees have already arrived in member states, and the EU reacted to the war with sanctions on Russia and arms supplies to Ukraine. Systemic disinformation and propaganda for war with a clear aim of serving Russia's strategic interest can be banned, at least temporarily. However, the idea that specific media outlets should cease to be considered media if they do not fall under certain standards might open the possibility for arbitrary selection. As we already see, some national regulators decided to discontinue the transmission of additional Russian programs that are not covered by the Council regulation. These measures should be taken according to national laws and constitutional principles, avoiding, let's say, blanket bans. Just a couple, actually three very brief points more. online operators. It's as we saw, the ban includes the content that is online, the content of Russia Today and Sputnik that is distributed online. I think that it's important to define also in general clear procedures for the removal of online content, as private operators are asked to act in these regards. And when it comes to the implementation, for instance, of self-regulatory measures such as the code of practice on disinformation, it should be recommended that the suspension and blocking of media is done through a process that is transparent and accountable. I raise at the end an issue of effectiveness, because there is this ban, yes, and there are the sanctions, there are the authorities and member states that put in place all the relevant measures to implement the ban. Nonetheless, it seems that there are some ways to circumvent the ban itself. So the information, the content distributed by these media outlets is still somehow online. And last but not least, it should be relevant and important instead of thinking of this kind of measures to invest more and more in media and information literacy. This situation indeed stresses the importance of investing more in citizens and in the capacity of citizens and users of the media and online information, and importance to invest on them, as this would help a lot in avoiding this kind of interventions that could raise some definitely some questions of consistency, let's say, with our general values in the EU. I just highlighted some points. I give the floor back to Pierluigi for the other interventions. Thank you.
Thank you, Elda, for framing the legal question and also opening the discussion. I think I will move now to Karimi Burki. Karimi is the president of the Belgian regulator, Le Conseil Supérieur de l'Audiovisuel, but is also, and what is very important in this context, is the chair of ERGA, the European Group of Regulators of the Audiovisual Media Service, and clearly ERGA is impacted by the decision of the Union and by all the situation. And also, let me clearly we want Karim's opinion on the legal situation, on the general situation, and also, if I can take something from Elda's intervention, also from the relation between this EU intervention and the situation in member states and the initiative already taken by member states. Would be interesting to understand this relation. Karim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pierluigi, and thank you very much for the invitation. First of all, I'm glad we're having this debate, and we always have to remember that we are able to have the discussion online and quite publicly because we live in Europe. I guess the discussion about the interdiction on the Russian media or the European media in Russia cannot be discussed in this way. So this is a thing that we've got to bear in mind, and this is a luxury we share. But actually, this is not a luxury. This is the basis of our way of thinking, freedom of expression. And so this is, I think that we should always bear that in mind, that we can discuss this among us freely. First of all, we have been discussing this situation right after the invasion of Russia. And we've had the discussion in Ukraine, and as Elda brilliantly reminded us, there had been ban on several Russian medias by members. And we had the discussion with our Latvian colleagues a few years ago, because there has been a case that have been discussed at ERGA level. And actually, what was happening in Europe, as you remember, is that Baltic states had decided some bans. Poland has decided also a ban, and Germany had also decided a ban, but on other legal grounds, on a specific rule that says that foreign-owned media, foreign state-owned media should have a German license, which Russia Today and Sputnik did not have, so they were banned. So we had a scene in Europe where there were no, let us say, common approach towards Russia Today and Sputnik, because when we are discussing with our French colleague or Spanish colleague, the situation was much less clear-cut than it was in the Baltic states or in Poland. But of course, the signal of Russia Today and Sputnik were not exactly the same, because, of course, the Eastern countries were receiving Russia Today in Russians, whereas the situation in France and in Spain have specific media outlets, as the UK has had a specific media outlet. And Maria will surely go into detail about the decision of Ofcom later on. But so there were no common approach at a member state level, hence the decision of the Commission. And you perfectly reminded the legal background that allowed the Commission to intervene. And so at ERGA level, we took notice of the decision, supported it, considering the situation and the extreme situation we were in, and also ensured that all the players, all the economic players, were aware of the decision of the Commission, which was self-implementing. It didn't need any intervention from the national regulators in the implementation of the decision. And as far as I know, until today, because we are still monitoring the situation in all the member states, there hasn't been any non-compliance problem. There has been some discussion especially with some satellite companies, but on a general level, there hasn't been any discussion among the distributors or companies who were providing the signal or internet access providers who were providing the signal. So there has been a general application of this regulation across Europe. But let us think a little bit forward, because it also showed that there were no in the media law as it stands now, there were no possibility for a common approach at European level. So it has always been left to the national regulators to appreciate the situation and act upon, as you mentioned, the Audiovisual Media Service Directive. But we have felt in this occasion the need for a greater cooperation. And what we think, and it has to be still further discussed with the members, but that we think that the initiative that is in preparation by the European Commission, the Media Freedom Act, should allow us to think and to address such problem on a more coordinated manner. And so this is a discussion that will be ongoing, because as we know, the text is not published yet, and we are at ERGA have participated in the consultation, issued opinions that are available on our website. But we think that although the problem of disinformation has been at the center of the preoccupation of ERGA since many years now, we, let us say, at least me, at least I did not expect to have this problem in such an acute manner, and this year. So it has been quite not a surprise, as I said, but the fact that we have been working in a, let us say, in an era where, at least in the West, let us say, in the West, we were thinking that we can deal to a certain extent with disinformation. And because this, Russia Today has not been broadcasting since 3 weeks ago in Europe. So they've been active for many years. And the problem of disinformation, as I said, has been a constant interest for the regulators. And if I may say so, the disinformation, the state-owned disinformation by Russia has been active not since a couple of weeks in Europe. It started with the invasion of Russia, which, when I looked at some archives the other day, was also branded a special military operation, actually, at that time at the Russian government. So the same terminology. It was also a lot of information during the Crimea War. We have seen the hand of Russia. If we read the Mueller report in the United States, we've seen the hand of Russia on the spreading and using disinformation during, not the last, but the after last American election. And we have seen the hand of Russia disinformation, Russia-sponsored disinformation during the last presidential election in France also. So this whole thing has been happening since a lot of time. And to a certain extent, despite the discussion, despite the initiatives, despite all the initiatives that have been done to counter disinformation, the code of conduct with the platform, despite all the positive deeds that have been accomplished for media literacy as well, to support quality journalism, despite all that, this has been happening for the past 15 years. So one of the questions I ask myself now as a regulator is why also are we, European citizens, also so susceptible to disinformation? Why disinformation spreads itself so, if I may say so, so efficiently since 15 years, despite all the initiatives that we are taking? And I think that, so the question is a little broader than only media literacy or media question and media problem. And I think it refers to things like the distrust in our democratic institution that has been growing over the past years. I also think that this discontentment that has been showed at various levels among member states also paves the ground for the kind of distrust also that quality journalism has also to face, that institution have to face, democratic institution have to face. You know, if I want to make to take a very simple example that we all can acknowledge, you know, imagining that most of the Trump electors are still thinking that the election process in the United States has been rigged is still an amazement to me. You know, we all remember this phrase from this American politician, if I remember correctly, that we are all entitled to our opinion, but we are not entitled to our own facts. I wonder if this phrase now should be as efficient as it used to be. Because, and we've seen that also in the pandemic crisis, in the COVID crisis, the question of science, the question of truth, the question of how to build common grounds on which we can all discuss, you know, is beginning to be very, very challenging and very, very difficult. So the question of disinformation, because one would say that, you know, an informed person, an informed opinion, an informed citizen should tackle himself disinformation when he sees, when he looks at Russia Today, or when listens to false news, because they would know where it comes from. They would know that the standard of journalism are not respected, but not. And so I guess we've got to see the picture on a broader manner, and maybe not only on the question of media freedom. And maybe we can even question the sanctions that have been taken in regard to this concept of media freedom. Is Russia Today and Sputnik, are they media outlets or advertising agencies? So the same principle should be applied to advertising agencies and media outlets. So those are questions that I'm asking myself. And also when we speak about censorship, I always, when I have discussion, with colleagues about censorship, I always say that, but those medias have been operated since for many years. So can we talk about censorship when they've been operating about since many years? So all those questions are, to me, need a very nuanced answer. And so in the end, and I will give the floor back because I'm really also eager to listen to the colleagues' opinions, And in the end, we are living in Europe, in a continent and in countries where the rule of law rules, if I may say so. And there has been a procedure that has been initiated by Russia Today France in the front of the Court of Justice. And this is quite important, because media that have been forbidden in Russia cannot do that, And so, and I think that the jewel of our system is that Russia Today can have a day in court in Europe. And so they can contest the decision of the European Commission. And I think in the end, that shows that, we even if there was a ban on those outlets, and I don't dare to call them media outlets, even if there is a ban on those outlets, the decision can be contested. And that shows to me that democracy still works, and we will see the decision and that will be taken by the Court of Justice. And because it's always conflicting principle, and the court independently will decide if the decision was justified, proportionate to the aim. And I think that is very important for us to know that there is a judicial recourse for those kind of decision, which does not exist in Russia for the media that have been banned. And on a more philosophical point also, when I see that those medias know, because as you said, it can be in some way circumvented, are still continuing to use the official phrase, special military opinion, when more than 100 children have been killed by this invasion, So I give the floor to my colleagues.
Thank you. Thank you, Karim. It's clear that the picture that of the discussion, and also the doubts that you voice in this discussion, and the concerns are, I think we all share your concerns. Let's move to Maria Donde. Maria is Head of International Content Policy at Ofcom in the UK, and she's also involved, however, in EPRA, the European Platform of Regulatory Authorities, and she's also often involved in the Council of Europe committees. So also Maria has a view of the situation both from the UK and from Europe. Maria, please.
Thank you very much, Pierluigi, and thank you so much to your team for inviting me to this incredibly important discussion. I share many of Karim's comments, particularly the broader ones about all of us needing to ask ourselves questions about susceptibility to disinformation, about and in particular from the perspective of media regulators, what we ourselves can do and should do in relation to those questions of trust, resilience, and understanding, and so on. And I think there's probably quite a lot that we can still do. I also just wanted to comment briefly on the point about coordination between regulatory authorities in this situation. We in EPRA have been collecting as much information as we can. I'm sure similarly to the way that Elda has been, about what exactly regulators specifically have been doing over the whole of this period to respond to the crisis, and it is very varied. Elda outlined many of those actions, and of course they do and don't in some cases relate to Russia Today specifically, and also encompass other different types of sources. So I'm here and I'll speak very briefly, and I'm happy to answer any questions, perhaps particularly given I know there are many experts and many legal and regulatory experts on this call about the recent decision by Ofcom in the UK to revoke the licenses, the broadcasting licenses held by Russia Today. Or rather, in fact, the licensee, which is called ANO Novosti, sorry. So let me just say a couple of things about that decision, and again, as I say, happy to discuss it more broadly. The one thing I would say is that it is different in nature, and quite importantly different to the EU sanction and to the EU ban, because it is a decision which is reached by an independent media regulatory authority within the context of our very specific existing powers and duties, in a transparent, in a detailed, and in an accountable way. Now, both decisions are subject to review, to judicial review. That's fine, and indeed the EU decision is arguably more time limited in some ways than the Ofcom decision, but I think there is a sort of substantial difference of category between a political decision reached by governments and that reached by an independent media regulatory authority. I think it's worth making that contrast. The decision, for those who aren't aware, was on the 18th of March. Ofcom published its announcement that it was revoking the licenses of Russia Today. We have a long and fairly detailed decision, which I highly recommend you taking a look at, just not to take my brief summary for it. It outlines a couple of key aspects. I think fundamentally it outlines the absolutely exceptional nature of the circumstances in which we find ourselves now, mentioning the UN condemnation of the aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine, mentioning in particular the law that was passed in Russia, an amendment to the criminal code, which effectively criminalizes objective journalism, and to which the service is seemingly subject. And a couple of other things specific to the Ofcom decision, I suppose. One is our quite unique ongoing duty to be satisfied that the licensees who hold Ofcom broadcasting licenses are fit and proper to do so. This is quite a wide discretion given to the regulator, arguably, and so for us, we apply a very, very high test really to make a negative finding in this case. But it is important to note that this is an ongoing duty on Ofcom. We have to continue all the time to remain satisfied that all of our licensees are fit and proper, and so of course when circumstances change or seem to demand a re-examination of this, we have to conduct that re-examination. We have to consider the context, and once we've reached a decision, we have to act quickly, because by definition, the implication is that if we don't revoke a license in that context, then we are implying that we consider that licensee is fit and proper, which in these circumstances obviously was a question that we had to ask ourselves. It's quite important really in that context for us to act decisively in order to maintain the integrity of the broadcast licensing framework in the UK in and of itself. And I should note that we acknowledge in this decision that this revocation constitutes a significant interference in the licensee's Article 10 rights. But we consider in these circumstances that our decision meets the requirements of Article 10.2, which Elda already discussed today. So I mean, let me go into just a little bit more detail about the decision itself for the benefit of those who haven't read it, and then happy to move on or to answer questions. We mentioned the UN condemnation of the special military operation. We mentioned the, as I said, the introduction of this criminal code, and in our decision we make quite clear, you know, we use Russian sources for information that we provide in the decision. We talk about the effects of the law as acknowledged by Russian specialists, by Russian journalists and spokespeople and so on. And the fact that the way that the code is written means a penalty of potentially of 15 years in prison for those who so-called who are responsible for public dissemination of falsehoods about the use of Russia's armed forces. So any kind of fake, what is considered to be fake news by the Russian authorities on that. We say that it's difficult to see how any news provider based in Russia, as RT is, could cover the events in Ukraine responsibly in circumstances where a law appears to prohibit, with a potential criminal penalty of 15 years imprisonment, the dissemination of information that civilians are being killed by Russian forces, or that a war is going on at all. And we also say that as a state broadcaster financed by a state which has recently invaded a foreign state, as noted by the UN, and criminalized independent journalism, we cannot be confident that this broadcaster is able to comply and to abide by the rules that we have in our broadcasting code, which is every licensee's responsibility, on due impartiality and covering events of major social and political importance, as this of course is. So that's our reasoning based on the developments, both in terms of the UN's condemnation and in terms of the introduction of the criminal code. We note the fact that also, even ahead of this decision, we had already launched around 29 investigations into the content of Russia Today's news broadcasts between the 27th of February and the 2nd of March. This is an unprecedented number of investigations to be launched in one go by Ofcom. It's not a major weighting because the decisions have not yet been reached. Those investigations continue, but it was a factor in our consideration. We note the previous compliance history, including quite a number of breaches, although not recently, by Russia Today, and particularly noting that those breaches tended to relate to coverage of the Russian Federation's foreign policy. And again, I won't read it again, but we absolutely stress the fact that this is a totally unique and specific, unprecedented situation. We have never before had to consider a situation where we have a licensee which is financially dependent on a state whose own head of state, President Putin, has been personally sanctioned both by the EU and the UK, and whose the service's editor-in-chief is also subject to UK sanctions. So all of these aspects, including the Ofcom's own clear obligations to remain satisfied that the licensee is fit and proper, were part of our discussion. Just finally, on the freedom of expression considerations, we absolutely acknowledge that the rights of Russia Today and audiences, both to impart and receive information, which and we say this, we have said this many times in terms of our own oversight and regulation of Russia Today, includes the right for any broadcaster to provide the Russian viewpoint on news and current affairs, including positions which are critical of other member states, of NATO, of other countries, and so on, and the right to challenge accusations that are leveled at Russia. But we note that, you know, limitations are to freedom of expression can exist, and they, as long as they are necessary, reasoned, and proportionate. And in this context, and when Russian media providers themselves are subject to significant pressures in terms of freedom of expression themselves. This is a justified interference with Article 10 rights. I should also conclude that Russia today still does have the right to judicially review the decision, and they have 3 months to do so. They were also offered, of course, an opportunity to comment on our provisional decision in terms of revocation. They did provide comments. They felt that they should have had more time to provide further comments and to obtain legal representation. We felt that given the circumstances, the decisions needed to be taken quickly, and this was a matter of urgency. So on the basis that they were able to provide some comments and some response to our initial contact with them, we concluded the decision nevertheless. So that's the current situation. It's been received pretty well is perhaps not the right word, but certainly that there's been very little, I think, controversy about the decision in the UK. There have been some critical comments, but on the whole, there seems to be an acknowledgement that Ofcom's decision was reasonable. And there's not been a huge amount of public debate about it, I have to say. So I'm very interested in any kind of critical comments, or indeed any sort of reflections on the way in which Ofcom has reached this decision and what it might what impact it might have for others and so on. So very, very keen to discuss further. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Maria. It's very interesting also this framing of the Ofcom decision that is very different from, not in the content, obviously, in the end, not in the result, but in the framing with respect to the EU Council regulation, which an administrative discussion and evaluation motivation has been already done, and we'll see then the legal continuation of the evolution. I'm very happy that we have today also with us Ricardo Gutiérrez, because Ricardo is General Secretary of the European Federation of Journalists, is involved as a member in the Council of Ethical Journalism, and in the executive committee of the European Trade Union Confederation. So he represents the world of journalism and a stakeholder of this. But I'm also particularly happy to have Ricardo, because I saw his first immediate reaction was very doubtful and critical of this decision of the EU Council regulation. So I'm very happy to have some of the knowledge of Ricardo opening this discussion for us. Ricardo, please.
Thank you, Pierluigi. Indeed, I'm not a legal expert. I'm a journalist. I will focus my intervention on two main issues: facts, first of all, as a journalist, it's a bit normal, and principles as well. Several speakers reminded that officially the European Council has imposed an economic sanction on RT and Sputnik. But in practice, as a journalist, I see it as a restriction of freedom of expression, a restriction decided in a rather arbitrary way by governments. So this is the first reason for concern, I would say, from the European Federation of Journalists. Normally, in a democracy in Europe, it's not up to governments to decide to ban a media. This is the exclusive competence of independent regulators. In this case, national authorities did not use the normal framework of media law with all the democratic guarantees that this implies. They use the framework of economic sanctions directly imposed by governments. RT and Sputnik did not benefit from the media regulation regime in force in Europe. It was not an independent body that took the decision to ban them. There was no investigation into the infringements that could have justified the sanction. RT and Sputnik were not able to assert their rights of defense. So in our view, the European Council has in a way bypassed the protective rules that apply to the media, including propagandistic and biased media. I think that it's important to remind that it would have been possible to use the normal framework of a ban issued by an independent regulator after investigation, allowing right of defense. It has been done. You reminded it, Elda, in many countries, in Bulgaria, in Germany, in Estonia, in Lithuania, in Latvia, Poland, and later in the United Kingdom. So it was possible to respect, I would say, the European principles of media regulation. The fact is, European governments prefer the path of arbitrary state censorship. That's the word. I believe that this is a victory for Mr. Putin. I believe that it's a defeat for democracy. My second point, this arbitrary censorship by EU states is totally ineffective. This morning, I asked Google search how to watch RT. I clicked on the first link, which took me to the Canadian video platform Rumble. I clicked on RT Live, and immediately I accessed the streaming RT channel from a simple computer from my office here in Brussels. In addition to the streaming, Rumble offered lots of other archived RT videos, dozens of videos released after the official ban on 2nd of March. So European policymakers are deceiving citizens into thinking that the problem of propaganda and disinformation has been solved by censoring 2 media outlets. That's not true. Because, of course, censorship is simply not the way to fight disinformation. It was not mentioned yet, but on Friday, the Swiss Federal Council decided to implement the 4th package of EU sanctions. Not being an EU state, they have the right, of course, to implement the same sanctions, except one, the ban of Russian propaganda media. It's interesting to listen to the explanation of the Swiss authorities. They said, although these channels are tools of targeted propaganda and disinformation by the Russian Federation, the Swiss Federal Council believes that countering untrue and harmful statements with facts is more effective than banning them. And I fully agree with the Swiss Federal Council. Third point, the measure is counterproductive. The EU states' decision is counterproductive. RT and Sputnik had a marginal audience in the EU, especially compared to RT in Arabic or RT in Spanish in South America. The few citizens who followed RT and Sputnik in Europe are now even more convinced that these channels were telling the truth since they are being censored. The European decision reinforces the conspiracy reflex of the few viewers of these channels in Europe. The counterproductive effect of the censorship will be even more terrible if the legal action brought by RT France before the Grand Chamber results in the censorship being condemned by the judiciary. Another counterproductive effect is the devastating example that the European Union is setting for autocrats around the world. Russian propagandists say they are doing the same as the EU by closing down independent media in Russia. In Mali, the junta says it is doing the same as the EU by banning the French channels RFI and France 24. And yesterday, in Afghanistan, the Taliban said they were doing what the EU does by banning Voice of America and the BBC. Of course, these regimes would have banned these media anyway. But the EU offers them arguments that make it easier for them to do so. My first point, a biased source is still a source for journalists. RT and Sputnik were a valuable source for journalists and analysts seeking to expose the Kremlin's rhetoric, the Kremlin's narrative. This decision, the EU states, has deprived journalists of an essential source. A biased source remains a source. It is regrettable that this is no longer available for journalists. My last point is about the future. Should we expect further steps in censorship? I was informed on Friday by the General Secretary of the Dutch Association of Journalists, NVJ, Thomas Bruning, that the Dutch regulator had warned him that the use of video images from RT by Dutch journalists in the Netherlands was also prohibited. In other words, Dutch media and journalists are no longer allowed to use footage from RT or Sputnik for their on editorial productions. The regulator clarified that this would be illegal and subject to prosecution, There is therefore an indirect censorship that operates on journalists within the European Union. And I can tell you that the Dutch Association of Journalists, the NVJ, is considering legal action against this censorship, together with other freedom of expression organizations in the Netherlands. I also recorded this weekend strong concerns from journalist organizations in the Balkans, very worried by the position taken by BEREC, the body of European regulators for electronic communications, on March 11. Following the EU sanctions, BEREC called on regulators to ask internet service providers to shut down all the websites related to RT and Sputnik, including subdomains, without a court order in this case. And this situation of ISPs shutting down websites without a prior court order is a dangerous precedent that is of great concern to independent media and journalists in the Balkans, and not only in the Balkans.
Thank you, Ricardo. I was right that you were the right person to voice some of the doubts that the journalistic profession is really facing in this. And there are some complications, as you show, also on the rebounds on the journalistic activity in Europe. That is was very interesting to hear. We move to our last panelist, that is Elis Karpikova. She's a global freedom of expression at Access Now, lead at Access Now, and she has experience working in EU Fundamental Rights Agency, the Council of Europe, the European Health Center for Minority Issues in Kosovo. Eliska, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here today. And indeed, I'm representing organization Access Now, which is a global human rights organization that defends and extends online users at risk around the world, which also means that we do have a presence in Ukraine, and we have been engaging on this unlawful war against Ukraine from the very start of the conflict. And perhaps just to give you the overview of what's currently happening on the ground, not only in Ukraine, but also, and I think that also needs to be underlined, the number of Russians that are being cut off any access to independent and adequate sources of information that is equally the part of this information war that is currently happening and directly impacts the operation of number of online platforms that willingly or unwillingly became the main access to information. And also are often a vital line how to actually access those information. So at the moment, WhatsApp, Telegram, and YouTube still remain accessible in Russia, but the vast majority of other international platforms are still being blocked. Currently, the Kremlin appears to be creating a system of parallel national apps that should actually replace the big tech options, so the companies that are the regular suspects in the information space, which however will lead to strongly centralized, consolidated version of the internet, which only will further reduce already heavily constricted online civic space in Russia. And at the same time, last week, Meta has been proclaimed as an extremist organization, outlawing Facebook and Instagram, except WhatsApp, which is still accessible due to the fact that according to the decision of the court in Moscow that proclaimed Meta to be extremist organization, it doesn't disseminate information to public, and thus it does not actually fall into this prohibition. So this is just to give you an overview, on one hand, how important online platforms are in this space, and how far-reaching consequences all of this can have on the protection of fundamental rights, whether it's the freedom of expression or access to adequate information. We already heard quite a lot about the ban. And of course, as it has been already mentioned, ban also concerns the internet intermediaries and online service providers. And indeed, it's the case that Russia Today or Sputnik has always been sort of a tool for creation and spread of disinformation and misinformation or false information. And to some extent, we do welcome the EU initiative that is being grounded in the community law as a joint response to this constant spread of not only disinformation and misinformation, but perhaps in the context of war in Ukraine, the war propaganda that can be legitimately restricted, not only within the meaning of the EU law, but also within the meaning of international human rights law under Article 20 of ICCPR, or also General Comment 11. And we constantly see policymakers and legislators interchangeably using the terms such as disinformation and misinformation and propaganda of war, which are, however, if you look at it purely from the content category, these are very different categories of user-generated content. Disinformation and misinformation is traditionally approached as potentially harmful bad legal content, while another clearly qualifies as a form of illegal content. And it has been already mentioned by other speakers that we actually have some level of precedence within the EU, and that such a decision, and these decisions also come from the Court of Justice of the European Union in a number of cases, and also within the decisions by independent media regulators in member states. And I also would like to underline one argument when it comes to broadcasting or consumption of the media in the EU. While in some countries, indeed, the outreach of these media doesn't have to be so far-reaching, the media consumption across the European Union significantly differ. So if something is valid in case of one member state, it does not necessarily have to be the case in other parts of the European Union. And it was also rightly pointed out that this decision can be actually challenged in front of independent judicial authority. Having said that, we also see potential dangers of this ban for fundamental rights protection within the online environment. And that's mainly in a way how these can be potentially implemented. Partially, this analysis is based on informal response that was issued by the Commission and eventually leaked, which is sometimes the reality that we are dealing here in Brussels and elsewhere, where potentially, if this ban is being implemented by the search engines such as Google or by social media platforms such as Facebook, this could result into general monitoring of user-generated content online, which is currently being prohibited by Article 15 of the e-commerce directive, as well as upcoming future legislation, the Digital Services Act, which I'm sure I don't have to introduce in further details to this expert audience. Such a circumvention of general monitoring, since the platforms could only actually implement this ban by deploying automated tools that are usually context blind and don't necessarily protect other types of content, such as journalistic content, because they are unable possible to distinguish those, or then maybe potential requirement to also monitor identical or equivalent content to the one that it tries to restrict could indeed result to overcompliance of platforms and ultimately to removal of legitimate content. However, we were not provided with any concrete guidance that would be formal and publicly available and prepared by the Commission how exactly intermediaries should actually implement and enforce the ban. And this is definitely something that still needs to be done, and we hope to see more formal approach by the Commission to respond to these questions. I think it's also important to underline within the online environment that platforms themselves started taking action against these type of content before the RT Sputnik ban issued by the European Union saw the daylight. We saw platforms taking decisions not to promote this content, block the accounts, and these decisions were purely made on the platform's own decisions, usually established on their own terms of service. And we know that if platforms act on the basis of terms of service, these actions are usually non-transparent, they're highly opaque, and they result in removal of legitimate content, which can also serve as a documentation of human rights abuse or war crimes that is happening on the ground. This wouldn't be for a first time that we actually witness such a reality, and that's why our worries are rather justified. We saw these cases or this sort of material disappear for good from YouTube platform, for instance, during the war in Syria, where a number of our partner organizations that specifically work on documentation of these human rights abuse online reported these sort of cases. It's quite important that this type of content is being preserved, because later on, this content can be and serve a significant role in international investigations or in further proceedings of international judicial bodies. Not even mentioning another final point, which are, of course, the carve-outs from non-transparent content governance policies deployed by these online platforms. We already know that these carve-outs, for instance, from hate speech policies by Facebook is already happening. But again, we can only rely on the reporting done by independent media that actually reported the cases and have the sort of, at least the overview, what these carve-outs constitute of. But given that we don't have the exact access to these policies, we cannot assess what will be the exact consequences of these policies and what exactly they consist of. So from our viewpoint, there are still more question marks than the concrete conclusions, but we can definitely agree that there is certain danger for fundamental rights protection within the online environment without necessarily contesting the intention of the European Union in order to send out a very clear message that seeks to, at the end, protect the media pluralism within the EU. It will be quite interesting also to see how this overall situation will impact the future or current legislative proposals that are pending at the EU level. And we already see the first signs or the requirements that the upcoming Digital Services Act should also contain some emergency trigger mechanism. And these demands are definitely being inspired by what is currently happening in Ukraine, and also realization that at the moment we don't probably have enough legislation in our toolbox to actually respond to those situations. However, this can also bring further dangerous solutions for the protection of fundamental rights. It's very difficult to properly define what constitutes emergency situation. It's very tricky to then establish a clear sunset clause. And also we need to be very careful about what kind of competence we at the end waste into our public authorities when it comes to the proclamation of the state of emergency, which is particularly difficult and tricky concept under the international human rights law. I will stop here, and I'm looking forward to future conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisa. To pass to the final part of our discussion, I would leave the floor a moment to Conrad Blair-Salmon, one of our researchers, that will summarize the several questions that arrive from the audience, and then we'll come back to our speakers. Conrad.
Thank you. So far, we have 4 questions, and I will also add my own to that. So that's 5. I will try to summarize them shortly. So my question is to Mr. Brogi, who mentioned that there hasn't been any non-compliance problem among national regulators in the EU, but at the same time, we can see in many member states that the websites of RT.com and Sputnik News are still available. So what is the reason for that? And then the next question is from Will, who asks whether there will be similar bans that target other brutal regimes, maybe even those that are allied with Western countries. So whether this decision could maybe pave the way for some other similar decisions in the future. Florina Tufescu asked whether Article 215 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU and Article 29 of the Treaty on European Union are seen by panelists as a sufficient and adequate legal basis for the decisions or for these measures. And I think part of it has already been answered, but maybe there might be some additional comments on this. She also asks whether there is an initiative that can be supported by those who want the measure to be reversed in the EU. And Sina van den Bogaert had a question to Maria Donde. She wants to know why the possible human rights violations by Russia by means of the new criminal law are related or are relevant for determining that the Ofcom decision is proportionate. Because in her view, the only relevant element is whether the same goal, safety and security, can be reached by less intrusive means as well. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Konrad. We will give the floor again to our speakers. I will start from Karim now because it has been very nice to remain with us even if at another meeting. But Karim, please.
Thank you, Pierluigi. Well, as I said, we are monitoring the implementation of the decision in one of the subgroup that has been created for today's work. And all the info we gather, we will transmit them to the European Commission about the implementation and problems that are faced in some member countries. And when I last had a meeting with my colleagues, it was 10 days ago, I guess, and in most of the countries, there were not that many possibilities of circumventing. No, things might evolve. It's a day-to-day job to see if the measures are circumvented. But anyway, we have ensured the Commission that we will give them a report on how it is on the ground and if the measure is effective at all. For the rest, I want to go back to what I said in my introductory remark. We need a system at European level, I guess, to assess those kind of problematics. And I said that the initiatives of the European Media Freedom and Freedom Act should be a tool that should give the regulator more power to do so, because of course we are all under let us say doubts sometimes about the legal certainty of the European decision, but it illustrates the fact that there is no coordination mechanism. For example, we could have thought that, for example, a decision taken on the basis of the directive by one regulator could be reviewed at European level and then implemented at European level, because then all the guarantees that Ricardo has mentioned have been duly processed. This is a way of thinking. The other way, if we follow the German example, is to ask any outside of Europe and stately owned media to have a license in Europe, as the Germans do within their system. So there are ways of thinking of, let us say, trying to work out a system that would be more in compliance with general media law. Because the problem here, I guess, is that the decision was not taken on the media law, but on economic sanctions, which result on a limitation of the freedom of expression. And as I said, we will see if the decision taken by the Council is right and proportionate, because, as I said, there is a recourse in front of the Court of Justice. But nevertheless, at ERGA, we are convinced that there should be a general system that would allow a reaction at European level in this kind of circumstances, and not invoking other, let us say, regulation to take those kind of decision. And of course, hopefully, we won't have to do it. We won't have to do it again. But the fundamental question remains. The fundamental question that I raised remains: how are we so prone to disinformation after everything that has been done and all the flux of correct journalist information that are still available? And that is a more fundamental question, because we are now discussing that, comfortably sitting in our home or in office, but the situation on the ground is very different in Ukraine for the journalists who are doing their job and for the people who are suffering from the Russian invasion. And so we've got to also, take in account the reality of the things that we are discussing. And this is sometimes very difficult, but I guess we have to be also efficient and not naive against the threats that are let us say, that the democracies are facing. And it is a very, very complicated questions.
Thank you, Karim, and we understand the complication that you are. I want to give the floor quickly to Eliska, because she has also to leave. I wanted to give her the occasion. Let me say, Eliska, that your discussion about the role and the behavior of platforms is something that would deserve a webinar per se, and probably we'll do it soon. Please.
Thank you very much for giving me space. So maybe just very quickly to tackle whether we really need these emergency response mechanism within the EU law. And mainly, of course, my comments are connected to the online platforms. I would like to underline that there is a number of legislative initiatives now coming from the European Union that will definitely strengthen obligations and responsibilities of whether online platforms or so-called very large online platforms where actors like Google or Meta would definitely qualify as such. And maybe instead of coming up with the emergency trigger mechanism that brings its own difficulties, such as disproportionate powers invested in the European Commission, again, how are you going to secure the proper definition and what amounts to emergency situation? We should maybe work on those due diligence safeguards that already now exist in the draft legislation, from human rights impact assessments to independent audits, the obligation for platforms to actually conduct the assessment before they enter market, but also when they leave market, especially in the situation such as war, where actually even their departure from the country can have fatal consequences for the protection of fundamental rights. For instance, DSA proposal currently does contain article that will oblige platforms to establish co-regulatory measures such as crisis protocols. So to have those future delegated acts that will actually specify what has to be in those crisis protocols and when they should kick in might be much more effective approach than coming up very quickly with hastily drafted new addition to already existing negotiated proposal that might have rather fatal consequences for fundamental rights protection online in the future. Thank you very much for giving me space, and I look forward to future events and discussions on EUI ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisa. I would like to go to Maria Donde again now. Maria, there are questions from the floor for you, and your Ofcom decision and position in this case has been of major interest somehow. So maybe you could.
Thank you very much. In answer to the question that was posed in the Q&A, I responded briefly, but essentially, apologies if I was insufficiently precise. But the main focus on the decision of the Russian Federation to criminalize certain certain speech, certain definitions and certain terminology. We were interested in that in the context of its impact on RT, not in terms of its impact on journalists more widely. I mentioned quite simply, just by way of context, the fact that might also have an impact on the freedom of the media in Russia in a more general sense. So it's really, it was in the context of how that affected RT and its ability to comply with the Ofcom broadcasting code, which is a legal requirement for any Ofcom licensee that I mentioned, the criminal code. On a general point, thank you very much for the interest in the Ofcom decision. I think Eliska in particular has very well articulated some of the broader implications of the kinds of things that are happening at EU level for the online space, and I was very interested in particular in Ricardo's comments as well. I think we will probably need to talk more about this, and particularly within the EU context and that sanction, because I do think that there is something quite specific about the Ofcom decision, which perhaps is, while unprecedented, probably may have less of a rippling impact in the coming months. But I would certainly be interested in hearing any other views on that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. I leave Ricardo for last. I go to Elda a moment. Elda, what can we expect from this, especially from this review by the courts? What timing, what you think that will happen on these situations? But you comment on whatever you want, but I would be interested in this angle.
No, I wish I knew. I mean, because this could be the answer to our discussion today. But indeed, I would stress that probably, I mean, in my presentation, I stressed the fact that the authorities somehow already intervened and have the power somehow to intervene and apply existing rules at national level also to tackle this kind of issues. And somehow I think that I implied that using this kind of legal means, everyone is happier somehow, because there is a way to object to the measure, to appeal, and to immediately understand what law has been implemented, has been claimed in the specific case. Indeed, probably considering that there are national remedies that could be used, that in the end the ban is not effective, as there are many other ways to see these channels outside, let's say, the usual broadcasting systems. I wonder whether in the end it was worth for the EU to do this ban, even if I can understand in terms of immediate reaction, it could be somehow justified as an immediate sanction to a government to government, because in the end these are considered as let's say immediate, are part somehow of the government strategy and propaganda. So they are strictly, these two broadcasters are seen as strictly linked to the government. Probably if the court will I mean, agree with the claim of Russia Today, it will be somehow an interesting, let's say, proof for EU democracy and values indeed, and probably it will be a good measure of how democracy is effective and how these values are still present in the EU. On the other hand, I understand again the move somehow of the Council, because probably is somehow a very let's say a very a reaction that wasn't thought probably enough, and I understand also that the Swiss case, that after all this discussion within the EU, Swiss decided not to include this part within the ban. I'm not an expert indeed of the rules on common foreign and security policy, because they are not, let's say, the regular way the EU works. But I had a quick look at what are the cases in which this Article 215 was used in previous cases. And if I'm not mistaken, probably this is the only one where media are involved. So unless it is the first step, I mean, for further application of similar principles, but unless I think that the scope of this Article 215 was intended for other situations, probably. And but indeed, I'm looking forward to hearing what the court will decide in this case. That, of course, I mean, the decision and the regulation come in a very specific period, indeed, where there is an emergency, there is a war. So this can justify a bit of rush, I mean, in defining this kind of measures.
Ricardo, as you heard in this discussion, there are decisions, there are courts expected, there are doubts also. And also there are the journalists on the field, and so this could be also something on which you want to hear your final word. How is going the situation? What is your information on the...
Well, as you know, 6 journalists have been killed yet in Ukraine. We are in touch with our colleagues in Ukraine, which are now relocated in Western Ukraine. They are still operating. I mean, the 2 main journalist organizations in Ukraine are relocated in Western Ukraine. We bring them support, and of course, I'm a bit, I'm very concerned, because if you look at the attacks, and I should say that these attacks are coming from the Russian side, it seems more and more that journalists are really targeted. So it seems to be, we seem, it seems we are facing a coordinated action against journalists on the ground. And this means that we are facing war crimes from the Russian side. So we are really concerned. We are also concerned about the fact that many journalists are operating in the ground without the needed protection. So we call again media outlets, media companies to ensure the protection of journalists on the ground. I fear we will face in the coming days more and more cases of wounded and maybe dead journalists, and it's a pity, of course, but as a journalist organization, we do what we can to avoid such dramatic issues. And just maybe to clarify my point, you know, regarding the disinformation and propaganda, I'm not, of course, promoting the dissemination of propaganda. You know, genuine journalism is the opposite of propaganda. And of course, member states should not remain passive in front of disinformation. My message is to them is just to tell them that we believe that censorship is not the right response, not the right antidote. What we need is promotion of quality journalism, promotion of ethical journalism, media literacy for all, media pluralism. It's an obligation, a positive obligation for the states to promote the pluralism of the media, and transparency from those in power. You know, we need that global positive ecosystem. It's the best way to tackle this information.
Thank you, Ricardo. I think we are at the time. Let me conclude the saying that is a difficult discussion. We'll continue it. Clearly emerged several things on this discussion. First, that the border between freedom of media and freedom of information in exceptional circumstances like dramatic circumstances like a war are clearly tried and become more difficult to understand and to design. Second, is emerging in this discussion that is very difficult and very complex to draw the difference between what are media and what are propaganda machines, and this will be an issue for further reflection. Third, I bring also the issue that is difficult to understand and to control the role of platforms in this kind of situation, in which even if states or authorities make a decision, then it's very difficult to translate this in reality, and this is a lesson that goes beyond the specific issue today. And these are all deep issues, and there are many others. And let me only conclude saying that I hope that the next discussion about this issue could be done in peacetime, so that we'll be in a different situation, and we'll be able to reason as free people, and that use their brain to understand things and to improve things. Thank you to everybody, to the participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. All the best.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.